In this movie, we will discuss performing multiple validations. When you need to validate several input fields, one decision that needs to be made is how many message boxes do you want to display to the user? That is, in our example, we have a message box for the first name, last name, and password fields. We also have a message box for a numeric value that is to be entered greater than 100. As we run a sample program, and I fail to enter the first name, but click on the Check Data button, you'll notice an appropriate message box is displayed that says the first name is missing. I click the OK button, and I'm allowed to enter the name, and then if I click Check Data again without entering a last name, once again I receive a message box, but this time the message box says last name missing. The program allows me to continue, and once again I will not enter a piece of required data, in this case the password, and I receive the message box password missing. Once all the required data for the three text boxes has been entered, I am now ready to examine the numeric text box. If I enter valid data, such as a value greater than 100 of 200, and click Check Data, the program does correctly proceed, and this message box is simply a marker to indicate that we've gotten to the point in the logic that the program will continue. Of course, in a more realistic program, we would be performing other statements and other calculations perhaps at this point. But on the other hand, if I were to fail to enter a value greater than 100, or actually a number at all, let's see what that will create. As I click the Check Data button, as you can see, the program has now gone into debugging mode, and the user would not be able to run the program. A format exception has been thrown by the Visual Studio environment, and we're pointing to the if statement that is comparing the contents of the text box to 100. The problem here is that our text box is empty, and we're trying to perform a numeric function, specifically the integer.parse function, on non-numeric data. And this is what's creating the exception that is causing the program to go into debug mode. To correct this, we need another if statement. So I will stop the program, and I will enter another if statement immediately before the if integer.parse statement, which will examine the contents of the text box before we even get to the integer.parse method. So by inserting the following if statement, I am simply comparing the text box to a null string, just as we did in the first if statements. However, we want to cut and paste our previous if statement so it now appears immediately below the newly created if statement, which will then execute only if all if statements preceding it are passed. I will need to introduce another else statement as well, so as to display an appropriate message box if the contents of the text box does prove to be empty. Now that we're in our code window, note the if statements are all properly aligned with their corresponding else statements, and with nested if statements, the first if statement corresponds to the last else statement. That is, the if statement that is comparing the first name text box is properly aligned with the else statement that is displaying the message box first name missing. And likewise, the second if statement corresponds to the second to last else statement that displays the message box for last name missing, and so forth. Only if we get to this point in the code where we have passed all 5 if statements will we receive the data OK message, and any other code to be executed will occur. Let's run our modified version of this program, and I'll enter data for the first name, last name, and password. This time I will leave the value blank once again, but notice I now receive the message missing data as opposed to the runtime exception thrown by Visual Studio. I click OK, and now if I enter data which is less than 100, I correctly received the message the value entered is too low. But once again, I can simply click OK and the user is allowed to continue. If I now enter good data for all 4 pieces of data, first name, last name, and password, and a value greater than 100, all the data has passed the validation techniques and the program will be allowed to continue. The use of the nested if statements is not the only technique you can use, but it is a very common technique to allow the program to continue only if the preceding if statement has passed its condition.